Melody Baker was a lawyer, a mother of 2 teenagers, and the wife of her true love, Will Baker. At 42, she was an incredibly attractive woman with dark hair, dark eyes, a slender figure, and a smile that could light up any room. Intelligent and intuitive, she had an uncanny ability to understand others. But now, as she sat at the banquet table, her marriage and family teetered on the edge of collapse. All because of her choices, her husband Will, and her client, Robert Dawson. The tension was palpable as Robert, Will, and Mel glared at each other with open animosity. This fiery conflict stemmed from Robert's shocking proposal. A weekend trade of partners, Robert with Mel, and Will with Gina, Robert's beautiful and much younger companion. Before witnessing Will's reaction to the suggestion, Mel had been dangerously close to agreeing. She had been yearning for an escape from the monotony of her marriage, and Robert Dawson had seemed like the perfect outlet. It all began months ago when Robert, a client of Mel's law firm, was sued by a multinational bank. He came to the firm seeking representation, and Mel was assigned to handle his case. As the case progressed, so did their connection. At first, they worked closely with their respective teams, but over time, their professional relationship evolved into something personal. They began having dinners alone, sharing more about their lives, and staying late for meetings that often veered into intimate territory. Mel knew she was treading dangerous waters. She couldn't deny Robert's charm. He was single, magnetic, and known for his prowess as a lover. As his company's vice president, Gloria Main, had gleefully mentioned. He's more handsome, smoother, and bigger than Will, Gloria had once quipped, referring to Will's more rugged demeanor. Mel couldn't stop herself from wondering what it would be like to be with Robert. The legal battle intensified, and so did their attraction. Mel found herself drawn deeper into Robert's orbit. He pursued her relentlessly, and while she allowed the occasional kiss or embrace, she stopped short of crossing the line. Yet, she couldn't ignore her growing desire. She was honest enough with herself to admit what she wanted, but terrified of the consequences it might bring. One evening, after a particularly late meeting, Robert suggested they take a break and head to his hotel room. The temptation was undeniable, but Mel firmly rejected the idea. It wasn't just about fidelity. It was about her sense of honor and her deep-seated fear that Will, with his keen intuition, would somehow know the moment she betrayed him. It was a risk she couldn't take. Mel shared this with Robert, who seemed to understand, though his disappointment was evident. But then the boundaries blurred even further. Before leaving that evening, Robert kissed her in a way that left Mel shaken. The kiss ignited something in her, but it also left her confused and conflicted. For a brief period, they distanced themselves, but it didn't last long. As negotiations for the case reached their climax, so did the tension between them. Mel skillfully maneuvered the case to ensure a favorable settlement for Robert, using her expertise to extract terms that worked in his favor. Once the case was resolved, Robert invited her out for an early dinner to celebrate. However, Robert's idea of celebration involved far more than food and conversation. He made it clear he wanted her, and Mel, while tempted, declined once again. Still, she couldn't deny the power he held over her. As they walked to her car outside the restaurant, Robert unveiled his boldest move yet. "I have a proposal," he said with a sly smile. Mel raised an eyebrow. "I think you already made it, and I already said no." Ignoring her, Robert continued, "There's a charity dance next Friday in town, where I'll be honored. I'm inviting you and Will to join me. I'll have a stunning young woman with me, Gina. She's a professional dancer, and we've been close for a while." Mel frowned, unsure of where he was going with this. "What are you saying, Robert?" "At some point during the evening," he said, his voice dripping with confidence. "I'll propose a trade. Will gets Gina, and I get you, for the weekend." Mel froze. Embarrassment and anger surged through her, but so did something else. Curiosity. "Do you really think he'd agree to something like that?" "Maybe not," Robert admitted, his grin unrelenting. "But I think there's a chance. And if he does, I promise you'll have an unforgettable time." Despite herself, Mel felt her composure slipping. Robert kissed her again, this time more assertively, and though she felt a surge of emotion, she quickly pulled away. She knew she needed to regain control of the situation. "I'll talk to Will," she said hesitantly, "and we'll come to dinner. But as for sharing, don't do anything without discussing it with me first. Let's see how the evening goes." "Okay." Robert smiled confidently. "Fair enough. But trust me, Mel, if we do this, you won't regret it." She got into her car and drove away, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. She knew Robert's words were likely true, but the real question was, at what cost? Mel told Will about Robert's proposal for the Friday night charity dance. Will's reaction was measured, but his words carried a sharp undertone. "Does this mean Robert is coming home with us?" he asked. Though he didn't say anything further, Mel could sense his radar had gone into overdrive. Will Baker was a writer, prolific and skilled. He wrote thrillers, detective stories, short stories, serious fiction, and, most recently, a science fiction novel. Though he wasn't famous, his books sold well, earning him more than Mel's high-paying job at the law firm. His flexible work allowed him to stay home with their two children, Sher, 17, and Mark, 15. Will had been a stay-at-home dad since the kids were little, managing school drop-offs and pickups while crafting compelling narratives in his home office. Occasionally, he traveled to promote his books. Most recently, he'd consulted on the film adaptation of his latest thriller, Danger Man, in Los Angeles. But for the most part, he stayed close to home, writing at a pace few could match. His talent lay in his ability to visualize scenes like a mental movie, complete with sound and imagery, which he then translated effortlessly onto the page. This gift for observation extended to his personal life. Will had a way of seeing through people, noticing things others overlooked. It was a quality Mel both admired and resented. She knew he used this ability on her and their children, and while it often prevented problems, it left Mel feeling exposed. She knew it was almost impossible to hide anything from him, including her thoughts about Robert. The banquet honoring Robert was held in a luxurious venue in the city center. Mel and Will had dropped the kids off with her parents for the weekend, freeing them up for whatever might unfold. Mel was nervous as they arrived. She wanted what she wanted, but she was also plagued by uncertainty. That hesitation momentarily vanished when she saw Gina. Gina was stunning, like something out of a dream. Her poise and beauty left Mel feeling both insecure and envious. She noticed Will's subtle glances at Gina during their introduction, and a pang of jealousy struck her. Perhaps this wasn't such a good idea, she thought. The idea of Will with Gina made her stomach twist, but it also distracted her from the bigger question. Would Will even agree to Robert's proposal? Mel found herself avoiding the answer as her emotions wavered between jealousy and desire. The evening began with an elegant dinner at the head table, where Mel and Will were seated with Robert, his vice president Gloria, and Gloria's husband, Rick. Conversation flowed easily, and Robert's speech after receiving his award was masterful. A mix of humility and subtle self-praise. Applause followed as Robert returned to the table. Will congratulated him along with the others, his demeanor calm and polite. Soon, the band began to play, and couples took to the dance floor. After a few songs, Robert led Mel out to dance. As they moved across the floor, Mel found herself captivated. Robert's smoothness, both in his steps and his presence, left her spellbound. She noticed how strong and athletic he felt, and she couldn't deny how much she enjoyed the way he held her. She was so caught up in the moment that she failed to notice Will and Gina still sitting at the table. As they began their second dance, Robert leaned in and whispered, "Are we agreed? Can I propose after this song?" Mel hesitated for a moment before saying, "Yes, yes, do it." The mix of emotions swirling within her, desire, excitement, and jealousy, made it impossible to think clearly. She wanted this despite the risks. When they returned to the table, Mel noticed that Will and Gina hadn't moved. Robert, undeterred, addressed Will directly. "What do you think, Will? I'd like to spend the weekend with Mel, and you could spend it with Gina. She's a fantastic dancer and an even better companion." Will's eyes locked on Robert, then shifted to Mel. His expression remained unreadable, but his tone was firm. "No." The single word carried finality, leaving no room for negotiation. Mel's heart sank. She recognized that tone. It was one of unshakable resolve. Her hopes for a weekend with Robert crumbled. Robert, unwilling to give up, pressed further. "Perhaps you should ask Mel." Will's response came quickly, and it was razor-sharp. "I'm not going to ask her, Robert. Our marriage is already on rocky ground. She could easily push me over the edge with the wrong answer, and that would be a shame, especially for our kids." The tension at the table became unbearable. Robert turned to Mel. "What about you, Mel? Will you accept my offer?" Mel glanced at Will, whose gaze was unflinching. She could see the storm brewing behind his calm exterior. The weight of her choices crashed down on her. She stood up abruptly, shook her head, and said, "No," taking Will's hand. She led him out of the banquet hall. The car ride home was silent. Mel's chest tightened with anxiety, and she fought back tears. She knew Will had figured it all out. The intrigue, the conspiracy, and her willingness to go along with it. He hadn't forced her to answer at the banquet, but his unspoken knowledge was devastating. She could feel the distance growing between them, and it terrified her. When they arrived home, Will headed upstairs without a word. Mel sat alone in the living room, replaying the night in her mind. She had wanted something exciting, something new, but now she feared she had only managed to destroy the foundation of her marriage. Upstairs, she heard the water running as Will stepped into the shower, leaving her to face the heavy silence of their unraveling bond. Mel sat in the kitchen, feeling lightheaded. She glanced around the house, the home where she and Will had raised their family, where they had once been so happy. Now the walls seemed to close in on her, filled with the weight of what had transpired. She couldn't shake the events of the evening or the look on Will's face when Robert had made his bold proposal. She thought back to how Will had managed to avoid directly forcing her to admit she wanted the exchange. Maybe this had been his way of holding the marriage together, of stopping the slow descent into divorce. If she had said it, if the words had left her mouth, it would have been impossible to ignore. While they both knew what she wanted, it hadn't been laid bare between them, and it terrified her. There were no justifiable excuses for her behavior, and the truth was too painful to confront. Upstairs, the shower stopped. Mel waited, her heart pounding. Eventually, she followed him. Will had changed into sweatpants and sneakers. He glanced at her briefly, then said, "I'm going for a run. Not sure why I even bothered showering." His tone was casual, but the indifference in his voice made Mel's stomach twist. He walked past her, down the stairs and out the door. Mel sat on the edge of the bed, her nerves fraying. Will's apathy was alarming. At the dance, he had seemed composed, but now it was clear that he was anything but calm. She showered herself, trying to steady her thoughts as she waited for him to return. An hour later, Will came back. Mel was in the bedroom, sitting in a chair, pretending to read a book on her Kindle, though the words swam in front of her eyes. The run seemed to have cooled Will's temper, but he still avoided acknowledging the situation. He hadn't directly confronted her desire for Robert, nor her willingness to entertain the idea of the exchange. Mel realized that if she had openly expressed her approval of Robert's suggestion, Will would have left her, not just at the dinner, but possibly forever. This was something he couldn't tolerate, and deep down, Mel knew it. She had known this for 20 years. And yet, she had still allowed herself to get swept up in Robert's allure. Will seemed intent on leaving things as they were, choosing not to force the issue. He didn't ask for an explanation, though Mel suspected he wanted one. Perhaps he didn't truly need one. He knew she had been consumed by her infatuation with Robert, to the point of losing her sense of reason. Counseling came to his mind briefly, but he dismissed it. If Mel didn't bring it up herself, it wouldn't help. Instead, he resolved to give her time to reflect. Quietly, he also decided to start keeping a closer eye on her and Robert. When Will returned to the bedroom, Mel was still pretending to read. He switched off the lights downstairs and came upstairs. Without a word, he undressed, showered again, and climbed into bed, pulling the covers over himself. The silence between them was deafening. Soon, Mel turned off her own light and got into bed, unsure if she should attempt a conversation. Fear paralyzed her, and she ultimately decided to stay silent. Sleep eventually claimed her after hours of tossing and turning. Will woke early the next morning, left without a word, and drove to his mother's house to pick up the kids. On the way back, he stopped at Denny's for breakfast. His eldest, Sherry, asked, "Where's Mom?" "She didn't sleep well," Will replied curtly. Mark, his 15-year-old son, chimed in, "How was the dinner dance?" "The music was fine. The food was fine," Will said flatly. Both kids noticed his sour mood and quickly changed the subject to schoolwork. The rest of the drive home passed quietly, though Will relaxed a little. Still, Sherry and Mark remained uneasy. Something was off and they could feel it. When they got home, Mel was already dressed and downstairs. She watched her family carefully as they entered the house, searching for signs that Will had discussed what had happened at the dance with the children. But they seemed calm, albeit a little subdued, which told her he hadn't mentioned it. Still, an awkward tension settled over the household. Sherry and Mark spent the day out with friends, while Will busied himself with housework. Mel pretended to read, though she couldn't focus. They barely spoke to each other all day. Dinner was a quiet affair, with words exchanged only to say, "Please pass the salt." Later that evening, Will went for another run. When he returned, he showered and climbed into bed, saying almost nothing. Mel tried to engage him. "Did you have a good run?" she asked cautiously. "Yes," Will replied, his tone clipped. He turned over and fell silent, leaving Mel feeling more isolated than ever. On Sunday, Mel made an effort to bridge the growing distance. When Will woke, she tried to cuddle with him, but he stood up almost immediately. He dressed quickly and went downstairs. Sherry and Mark left for the day, but not before whispering to each other. "What do you think is going on?" Sherry asked. Mark shrugged. "I don't know. Something about that dinner party." Sherry frowned. "It must be Mom. She must have done something." Mark hesitated. "Wasn't it for Mom's big client?" "Yeah, but it's no use guessing. If this keeps up, we'll ask them," Sherry replied. But even she wasn't sure that was a good idea. Then again, maybe not. It might ruin everything. The siblings parted ways, both uneasy about their parents' behavior. Mel spent the day cooking Sunday dinner, lasagna with cucumber salad. The kids enjoyed the meal, but Will barely touched his portion, leaving most of it on his plate. This was unusual for him. He typically had a healthy appetite. Mel tried not to let it bother her, but his actions felt deliberate, like a quiet punishment. After dinner, Will spent the evening watching a football game in silence. Mel pretended to sleep when he finally came upstairs. Once the kids were off to school, and Mel had left for work, Will sat in the quiet house, grappling with his thoughts. He picked up the phone and called his friend Mason Dabney, the manager of the hotel where the dinner dance had been held, and where Robert Dawson had been staying. "Mason," Will said after the usual pleasantries. "Is Robert Dawson still staying at the hotel?" Mason confirmed to Will that Robert Dawson was booked for one more night at the hotel and would leave the following day. Meanwhile, Mel's commute to work was filled with stress. Her anxiety was compounded by the knowledge that she had one final meeting with Robert and his vice president, Gloria, to wrap up all remaining details of his case. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. Mel led Robert and Gloria into the conference room. The discussion was quick and efficient, and they closed the matter within 20 minutes. As the meeting concluded, Robert turned to Mel and asked, "Are you okay after the dance?" Mel hesitated, glancing briefly at Gloria, who remained quiet but watchful. Then Mel replied, No, I'm not okay. My passion could cost me a lot." Robert frowned. "But nothing happened. He said no and you left. That's it. Nothing came of it." Mel sighed, her voice trembling. "He knows I wanted it. And from the moment we left until now, he hasn't said 10 words to me. He hasn't touched me at all." Robert shook his head, frustration flickering in his expression. "That's stupid. If he gives up on you over nothing, then he's the fool. Even if we had gone through with it, he'd still be stupid to let you go." He paused, his voice softening. "Please call me if he does." Mel didn't respond. Instead, she stood, shook hands with both Robert and Gloria, and left the room. As the two walked back to the hotel, Gloria turned to Robert with a knowing smile. "So, just the two of us this evening?" Robert nodded. "Yeah, I sent Gina away." Gloria smirked. "Looks like you'll be lonely again." Robert gave a small, confident smile. "We'll see." Mel tried to get back to work, but it was impossible to focus. Her mind churned with guilt, doubt, and frustration. By 3 p.m., she gave up entirely and went home. When she arrived, she found Will in his office, typing furiously on his computer. She stood at the door watching him silently. He glanced up briefly but then returned to his work without a word. After a moment, he finished what he was writing and finally turned toward her. Mel took a shaky breath and said, I'm broken. I couldn't work today. Whose fault is this? Mostly mine. I admit that. I was afraid to say anything, but I need to apologize. I need to know where we are. The kids are worried. I'm worried. Will leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Is your friend Robert still in town? He asked evenly. Yes, she replied. We had a short meeting this morning. He's leaving tomorrow. Will nodded slightly. He's a cocky idiot, full of himself. And you should have been full of him too. Mel flinched at his words, but her voice remained calm. I said no when he first suggested, But then he made me believe in his sly way that maybe you'd agree to Gina. I should have known better. A heavy silence hung between them. Finally, Mel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What can I do, Will? Will stared at her for a long moment before replying. I'm not sure. Nothing specific comes to mind. Mel knelt in front of him, her heart pounding. Everyone has their weak moments, Will, she said softly. He nodded slightly, showing no resistance as she leaned closer. Gently, she tugged at his shorts, guiding him onto the sofa. They stayed there together for some time afterward, silent. When it was over, Mel quietly got up and left the room. That evening, dinner was reheated lasagna. Mel's mood had lifted noticeably, and the children could tell. Sherry and Mark returned home and joined them at the table. Will hadn't emerged from his office until Mel sent Mark to fetch him. At 6:30, Mark knocked on the door and called, "Dinner's ready." Will came down to the kitchen. Mel watched him closely as he entered, surprised he hadn't come earlier. The children also observed him intently. He gave them a small smile, sat down, and began eating. He asked the kids about school, and the conversation slowly returned to something resembling normal. He even discussed cleaning out the garage with Mel, a project they had been talking about for weeks. Dinner felt more like the calm, familiar routines they used to share. It was the most normal thing that had happened in days. After the kids went to their rooms, Mel and Will cleaned up together in the kitchen. As they worked, Will suddenly turned to her and said, "Intimacy is good, but it's not enough." Mel froze, her heart sinking. His words cut through the fragile peace they had begun to rebuild. "I get it," Will continued. "This guy was hot. There've been a lot of hot guys in your life, maybe even hotter than him. So why now?" Mel sighed, leaning against the counter. "We worked together for months. He worked on me for months. It built up. He wasn't subtle in the end, and by then I was weak. I'm surprised I didn't go with him." Will's jaw tightened. "Me too. I really thought you would." Mel's voice trembled as she replied, "It shocks me too. I really wanted it, Will, but it makes me feel second-rate." "If only," Will interrupted her sharply. "It makes me feel second-rate." Mel looked up at him, her voice breaking. "You're a wonderful husband, a fantastic father. You're not second-rate. You're the best." "That could mean a couple of things," Will said coldly. "You're saying I'm the best long-term choice, but that guy was your short-term choice." Mel didn't deny it. "Well," she said softly, "I'll never know about him. He'd probably be a loser. I'll never know about any other guy. But you?" Will nodded slightly, then left for the bedroom. Mel stood alone in the kitchen, realizing the enormity of the work ahead. What Will had said was undeniable. On the night of the party, she had wanted Robert more than anything. Maybe not just that night, but the nights leading up to it, and perhaps even now. Over the next few months, Mel worked tirelessly to prove to Will that he was her one and only. She threw herself into repairing their marriage, determined to rebuild what they had lost. But things never fully returned to the way they were. Though they shared moments of intimacy, even good ones, something was always missing. Will often seemed distracted, as if he were still processing the events that had nearly unraveled their lives. Lately, Mel had been growing more and more irritated with how things had unfolded. The relationship between her and Will had never returned to what it was before the night of Robert's trade proposal. Both of them knew it, even if they didn't say it out loud. One evening, when Will was alone at home, he tried to analyze the situation from a distance. On the surface, what Mel had done didn't seem unforgivable. She craved a man who, realistically, was objectively attractive. She hadn't changed as a person, but she had wanted Robert so much that she had been willing to risk her family to pursue him. No matter how Will tried to rationalize it, the simple fact remained. His wife had wanted another man more than she wanted him, and that, perhaps, was the most painful part. He thought about what he had told her before, that no other woman had ever made him feel the way she did. At least, he hadn't met anyone like that yet. Sure, there had been attractive women in his life, like the blonde divorcee who lived a few houses down the street, but he never even came close to cheating. He was steadfast, unshakable in his commitment. But now, for the first time, he felt like he would always be his wife's second choice. The thought tormented him. It crept into his mind at night, even during the moments they shared together. He couldn't help but wonder, did she think about Robert when they were intimate? He assumed she did. Still, Will pushed those thoughts aside. He told himself that he had to stay with Mel for the sake of their children. Even though Sherry and Mark were older now, a divorce would still hurt them deeply. He told himself he could hold out for a while. After all, he still had Mel's companionship and intimacy, even if it didn't feel the same anymore. Well, sort of, he thought grimly. About 8 months after the evening of the banquet, Robert reappeared in their lives. He was embroiled in a new legal dispute, this time a challenge to one of his chemical patents. Since Mel had a chemistry degree from college, the case was a perfect fit for her skill set. To complicate matters, Robert specifically requested Mel to handle the case. One morning, Mel was called into a meeting with the 3 main partners of her firm, Abe Allenson, Bart Banson, and Caleb Carlton. To her dismay, Robert was already there. The moment she saw him, she thought, this is the last thing I need. Of the 3 partners, Abe knew Mel the best. He was also aware of the tension between her, Robert, and Will that had arisen during the previous case. After some tense greetings, Abe finally addressed her. Mel, we're all aware of the possible complications for you, but Robert has serious business here, and he specifically requested you. Given the circumstances, it's not unreasonable for him to want you on this. Mel shook her head firmly. Abe, I just can't do this. You know why? I have a family, and I want to keep it. Robert interjected, his tone calm but insistent. Mel, what happened before won't happen again. I promise you that. Mel turned to him, her voice cold. Even if I believed you, it's not just about what might happen. It's about how Will and I look at it now. It's different. Bart cut in, his tone more businesslike. Mel, this is a huge deal. For the firm and for Robert. Millions of dollars are on the line. You need to pull yourself together and be strong. I'm sure Will understand. Mel shook her head again. No, it's too much of a risk for me. Caleb leaned forward, his voice firm. It's also a huge risk for the firm if we abandon this case. We're all adults here, Mel, and Robert has assured us that he will refrain from any advances. Mel's voice wavered. Will and I don't need my salary. Not really. But still, I'll ask him about it. Robert spoke again, his tone softer but still persuasive. If Will objects, I'll talk to him myself. Last time, nothing really happened, Mel. I won't push you. But I'm in trouble here, and I need your help. That evening, Mel was a ball of nerves. She knew she had to wait for the right moment to bring up the issue with Will. He noticed her agitation as they sat together in the TV room and asked, "What's wrong with you?" Mel took a deep breath. "Robert has a new case. The firm wants me to handle it. It's about a chemical patent. I told them no, but they're insisting. If I refuse, it could cost me my job." Will looked at her with a calm but sharp expression. You know, a bachelor's degree in chemistry doesn't mean much in this kind of case, right? You'll still need to hire experts. Yes, Mel admitted. But Robert has a background in chemistry too. He says he wants me on the team because I can understand him without the extra cost of training someone new. Will's eyes narrowed. He wants you because you're unfinished business to him. His ego's hurt, and he's going to go after you. Mel hesitated. No, I mean maybe, but he also has a legitimate reason for wanting me to lead the team. He says he won't act like he did before. He has too much at stake. Will stared at her, his expression hard to read. How much contact will this involve? Mel hesitated again. He and Gloria have rented an apartment near the office. They'll basically be here for at least 6 weeks. Will let out a slow breath. After a long pause, he said, I'll leave it up to you. Maybe this is your chance to show me who's really number one. You know what's at stake. Mel nodded, her voice small. I know. Will got up and went to bed without another word. A few minutes later, Mel followed him. As they settled into bed, she reached over and stroked his stomach. I need a dose of love, she whispered. He gave it to her. Slowly at first, but then with increasing intensity. By the end, it was passionate and satisfying for both of them. Afterward, they lay silently beside each other. Mel broke the silence, whispering softly, Thank you. Will didn't reply. The night passed peacefully, and for once, Mel and Will slept soundly. The next day, Mel decided to take on Robert's case. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the one she felt compelled to make. Robert and Gloria began attending a series of all-day meetings at the firm. Mel was assigned 2 assistants, but neither of them had a background in chemistry, which only made her workload heavier. The second day saw even more intense meetings. 2 experts were hired to assess the situation, and the discussions went late into the night. Dinner was delivered to the office every evening as the team worked tirelessly. Mel didn't get home until 9:30 or 10 o'clock most nights, completely drained. One night, after the second day of work, Will asked as they lay in bed, Were there any problems? No, Mel replied. Just too much to do. And him? Gloria? Will pressed. Her husband doesn't seem to mind. I think. Mel hesitated. She told me it turned him on. She even tried to convince me about you and Robert. Will frowned. I put her in her place. I don't understand all this nonsense. Gloria owns her choices, that's what she told me. But there's no way I'd ever want a marriage like that. Mel said softly, You don't have to worry about it. Will sighed. That's not what's bothering me, Mel. If I sense any danger, I'll tell you when we need to talk. But I don't think that's going to happen. The intensity of work eased slightly after the first 2 days. Mel assigned her team basic legal research tasks, while she and Robert focused on discussions with the experts. After 2 weeks, Mel felt confident that Robert wasn't going to be a problem. She told Will as much, but he remained skeptical. Every evening when she returned home, Will watched her carefully. In bed, their intimacy improved. Mel made more of an effort and Will responded in kind. Yet, instead of reassuring him, her efforts seemed to fuel his doubts. She spent more time with Robert than with her own husband, and though Will was convinced that nothing physical had happened between them yet, he believed it was only a matter of time. He thought back to the first time she had worked closely with Robert and the spark that had developed between them. It wasn't just the professional collaboration. There was something deeper, a raw attraction. Even now, Will suspected it might take her by surprise again. One evening, about 4 weeks into the case, Robert returned from a business trip to Pittsburgh. He had been away for several days. That night, Mel came home with an unusual energy. The children were both at a neighbor's house for dinner, and the moment she saw Will, she dragged him into the bedroom. She was like a volcano, unrelenting and fiery. It lasted a long time because Will made it last. It was exhausting for both of them, but worth it. Afterward, as they lay together, Will turned to her and said, I guess I can thank Robert for that. Mel sighed deeply. Yes. What are you going to do? What have you done? Will asked, his tone quiet but pointed. Nothing. He hasn't really tried anything. Not openly, Mel explained. I mean, he hasn't, insisted. But there have been small touches, indirectly suggestive comments. Kisses? Hugs? Will pressed. No. Damn it, Will, no. Mel paused, her voice softening. I guess I should be grateful I can bring this home to you. For how long? Will asked. I admit this is becoming a risk. I have to finish this phase of the case, the training of the experts, but I really don't understand why this is happening. He's not more attractive than other men who've been interested in me. Will gave her a sharp look. Not for me, but for you? Him and you. He paused. You and him. Mel didn't respond. Will rolled over, trying to sleep. For him, it wasn't so easy. Mel, however, fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, as Mel was heading out the door to work, Will stopped her. His expression was firm, his voice calm but cold. If you give in, if he tries and wins, you know he's a dead man. It doesn't matter how rich he is. Tell him. Mel froze, stunned by his words. She stared at him, speechless. Will reached out and patted her cheek. So you both know what's at stake. I'll serve the time if I have to. Then, without another word, he turned back into the house, sat down to finish his breakfast, and walked the children to school as if nothing had happened. Mel drove to work in a state of mild shock. She tried to rationalize Will's threat, telling herself he didn't mean it, or that he wouldn't actually follow through, but deep down, she knew otherwise. She had seen the look in his eyes, heard the steel in his voice. He wasn't bluffing. She knew she had to finish the next 2 weeks with Robert and then hand the case off to other lawyers. She couldn't afford any missteps.
No pranks, no risks.
At the office, she poured herself a strong coffee and reviewed the latest materials from the experts. Robert and Gloria arrived at 10 a.m., bringing with them Jonathan Crisp, one of the expert chemists. Jonathan carried his Apple laptop, and the four of them gathered in the large conference room assigned for the case. The meeting lasted about an hour. When they took a break, Mel went to her office, hoping for a moment of peace. Robert followed her in and quietly closed the door behind him. What's happening to you? He asked, his tone a mix of concern and frustration. Mel replied to Robert's question with a steady voice, though her unease was palpable. Will is very worried about this situation. I tried to soften it, you know. I told him you weren't proposing anything serious. Robert smirked, leaning back slightly. Well, that's mostly true. Mel's eyes narrowed. That's not true at all, Robert. You're just skirting around the edges. But I know what you're doing. I know your purpose. Robert smiled, his confidence unwavering. We have chemistry. Mel laughed dryly, but it wasn't funny. Yes, I know. Yesterday, I almost killed poor Will as soon as I got home. He should be grateful. Better nights through chemistry. Robert quipped with a sly grin. Mel gave him a hard look. He won't kill me, Robert. Just you. So, is it worth dying for? For a moment, Robert froze, his smirk faltering. Maybe it's worth it, he muttered, though his tone lacked its usual confidence. Mel didn't flinch. The point is, Will has his own demons. They rage slow, but they rage steady. And if he says he'll kill you, believe me, he means it. What's worse is, he's capable of getting away with it. Before Robert could respond, a knock came at the door. Gloria stood outside, ready to call them back to the meeting. Without another word, they returned to the conference room, their conversation unfinished but heavy in the air. At home, Will didn't know whether his threat to Mel and Robert had truly worked. He had meant it in an abstract sense when he said it, but as time passed, the words lingered in his mind. He realized that if Robert ever crossed the line, if he ever slept with Mel, Will would be pushed to the brink. Whether that meant physically harming Robert or divorcing Mel, he wasn't sure. Both possibilities loomed darkly in his thoughts. The strangest part was watching Mel's vulnerability around Robert. Her attraction to him wasn't just physical, it seemed all-consuming. She had admitted to Will, perhaps unwisely, that she had never felt such intense chemistry with anyone else. Not even him. Was that really her fault? It was as though the pull she felt toward Robert was beyond her control, as if she had met the man she believed she was destined for. And where did that leave Will? Will had decided that if his warning didn't work, he wouldn't follow through with violence. But he knew one thing with certainty. He was done being his wife's second choice. If Mel gave in, their marriage would be over. He would never touch her again. And even if Robert left without incident, Will wasn't sure if he could live with the knowledge of her lingering desires. That evening, when Mel arrived home on time, the family sat down to dinner, a meal prepared by Will. She was relieved to find him calm and composed. They ate together, watched a basketball game, and later went to bed. "How was your day?" Will asked as they settled in. "Did you talk to Robert?" "I told him what you wanted me to say," Mel replied. "I conveyed your attitude toward him loud and clear. After that, there were no problems." Will was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, but you know it's all on you. Regardless of what I say, he'll probably keep trying once he's back home." "We'll see," Mel said cautiously. "What do you mean, we'll see?" Will's tone sharpened. Mel hesitated. "If he's not next to me, he won't be a problem." Will stared at her, his gaze intense. "I feel like reheated leftovers, and he feels like a five-star dish." Mel laughed lightly, trying to defuse the tension. "I'm not a gourmet. I like your cooking, even if it's leftovers." Without warning, she climbed onto his chest, her playful aggression catching him off guard. Will pretended to resist, but it was half-hearted. And truthfully, he didn't mind being swept away. For her part, Mel poured herself into the moment, trying to push away the guilt and conflict that lingered in her mind. But deep down, they both knew the truth. That night, as she was with Will, her thoughts strayed to Robert. And Will could feel it. The shadow of Robert loomed over them, a tension neither of them could shake. Will felt left out, and Mel was afraid of what the future held. The trade proposal had created an impasse in their marriage, one they had never truly resolved. And they both wondered, silently, if they ever would. Mel didn't lie to Will about how he was only second in her desires. She couldn't. Instead, she consoled him in the only way she knew how, through intimacy. But even that felt like a temporary fix, one that couldn't mask the deeper fractures in their relationship. The following days at work were especially stressful for Mel. Her team was busy preparing rebuttals to the expert reports submitted by the opposing side. On Saturday, she worked all day with Jonathan Crisp, who was finalizing his preparation for a trial scheduled for the following week in Stamen, Washington. Jonathan was set to fly to Spokane on Sunday, where he'd booked a room near Winesap on the Columbia River. By Thursday morning, the team of chemical experts had completed their work. Moving forward, much of the case could be handled remotely through phone or Skype. But during that week, Robert ramped up his attempts to seduce Mel. Despite her warnings and her efforts to keep her guard up, his techniques were subtle and effective. They stirred something in her that she couldn't fully suppress. The excitement he created didn't disappear. It followed her home. Will, as perceptive as ever, couldn't ignore the signs of Mel's growing passion. At breakfast one morning, Sherry teased them with a sly smile. "You're keeping us up late at night." Mel laughed nervously. "We'll get some noise suppressors." Mark chimed in. "I already tried earplugs. They're uncomfortable." Mel brushed it off with a smile. "It's not our fault, really." And the conversation ended there, though the tension remained unspoken. On Thursday, Robert invited Mel to lunch. He was set to fly to Pittsburgh the next morning for a preliminary hearing in U.S. District Court. Mel didn't need to attend the hearing, but she knew she would have to participate in the trial later on. Robert took her to an upscale restaurant near his apartment. Neither Gloria nor anyone else from the team joined them. Mel wasn't surprised. She had expected this. She knew Robert would try to make his move. Launching what she anticipated would be a full-scale attempt to draw her closer. Normally, she would prioritize caution over risk. But with the trial looming, she knew her collaboration with Robert would only deepen. Mel knew that the upcoming trial in Pittsburgh would require her to be away for 2 weeks, possibly including weekends. She also knew that she needed to decide whether to participate or to quit the case entirely. She saw her lunch with Robert as a kind of test. Lunch itself was mostly pleasant. Robert made it clear that he intended to eat first and then head back to his apartment for dessert. Mel refused politely, steering the conversation back to neutral topics. The food was good, and she allowed herself a single glass of wine. At the end of the meal, Robert slid closer to her on the round bench and hugged her. Mel didn't pull away immediately. Robert ran his hand along her cheek, his gaze lingering on hers. Mel looked him straight in the eyes, her resolve weakening. Never in her life had she wanted something so much and yet been so determined to give it up. It was a moment of intense conflict. Finally, Mel slid out from under the bench, breathless and trembling. "No," she said firmly, her voice low but resolute. Robert's face fell with disappointment. "Not yet, then," he replied, waving for the bill. Mel left shortly after, returning home to Will. She entered the house and found him there, as steady and familiar as always. "He's gone," she said, her voice shaking. "I need you." They spent the evening together in bed and elsewhere, until the kids returned home a little after 4 p.m. For Mel, the experience felt like dodging a bullet or something of a similar shape. She had made it through the encounter without crossing any lines, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The following week, a judge in Pittsburgh set the trial date for mid-June, 5 months away. Mel wrestled with the decision. Ultimately, she arranged a meeting with the 3 partners at her firm to discuss the situation. She began the meeting by making her position clear. "I'm not going to Pittsburgh for the trial," she said. Abe, the senior partner, frowned. "Why not? You did a fantastic job preparing the case. I'm guessing this is because of your husband's concerns, but nothing happened with Robert, right?" "True," Mel admitted. "But that was here where I could come home every night. In Pittsburgh, I'd be on his turf, and Will would be back home." Caleb, another partner, leaned forward. "Why don't you just, do it? If you're in Pennsylvania, who would ever know?" "I would know," Mel said flatly. "And Will would know, too. Maybe not right away, but he'd find out. He always does." Abe sighed. "We sympathize, but I think we have to persist." Mel smiled faintly. "Try to find someone else," she said, rising from her seat. Without waiting for a reply, she left the room. As she exited, Abe muttered, "She's got us stumped. At least we have time to figure this out." Caleb grumbled, "She's weak. I don't like weak." Over the next few weeks, the firm scrambled to find a replacement. They interviewed 4 candidates, but none were suitable. Eventually, they made an offer to a well-regarded lawyer from a prestigious New York firm, but he declined. In the meantime, Mel focused on training one of her assistants, Martin Blaine, to handle the trial. She worked tirelessly with Marty, coaching him on cross-examinations and preparing him to present their expert testimony. At home, Mel discussed the situation with Will. He wasn't surprised by the news. He had been expecting it all along. He knew there would be a trial if the case didn't settle, and he knew the firm would push for her involvement. One evening, Mel brought it up after dinner. "There's probably going to be a trial in Pittsburgh this year," she said. "They want me there." "And you said no?" Will asked. "I did. They've been looking for a replacement, but so far, they haven't had any luck. Time's running out. If you insist on not going, they'll probably fire you for insubordination." Will said. Maybe that's not the worst thing. You'll find something else. Maybe we'll write a book together. A novel with a marriage on the brink of collapse. Mel laughed. Scarlett staring at Rhett, shirtless. She's moving toward him. Is that what you mean? Will grinned. Maybe with different names. I wonder if Scarlett gives in. Of course she does. It's fiction. We have to sell the book. Will's expression grew serious. What about you? Would you give in if you were in smoky Pittsburgh? There's no smoke there anymore, Mel said softly. I'm not going to lie to you, Will. It's entirely possible. But the case is intense. It might not leave room for anything else. Probably not, right? Will didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was low. I feel like I'm just some leftover, Mel. Mel reached for his hand. Will, I'm not going. That's it. I'm training Marty to handle the trial. He's smart. He and I can consult over Skype every evening. I'll have transcripts to review. Will sighed. I think you'll always feel sorry for me and blame me. That's not a good foundation for a marriage. I love you, Mel said firmly. Only you. That's enough. I hope. That night they were consumed by passion. The children used earplugs, but they didn't help much. As the trial approached, Mel spent more and more time at the office. Sherry graduated from high school and prepared to start college at Belém, 2 hours away. Will busied himself with the preparations, trying to stay strong despite the growing tension in his marriage. On June 1st, 10 days before the trial, disaster struck. Marty Blaine was hospitalized in Pittsburgh with severe heart problems. Doctors attributed the condition to extreme stress and prohibited him from participating in the trial. The firm petitioned the court to delay the trial, but the judge refused. ABC is a large firm, he said. There are plenty of lawyers who can take over. Mel had been deeply involved in the case's preparation. She had interviewed the experts, overseen the cross-examination plans, and worked on the strategy. When the partners returned from the court hearing, they called Mel into a meeting. There's no choice now, Abe said. You have to go. Mel sat quietly, processing the news. Abe continued, While I feel bad for Marty, I think this is better for all of us. You're the best person for the job. I've booked you a room at the Westin, right next to the courthouse. Mel knew she had little choice. If she resigned from the case, she might still face disciplinary action from the Bar Association. Caleb had connections there, and she felt trapped between professional obligations and personal loyalty. Feeling overwhelmed, she went home to pack her things and try to calm herself. Will helped her load the car, checking the tires and oil before she left. He stood in the driveway as she drove away, giving her a small wave. As Will walked back to the house, a grim thought crossed his mind. The chances of her staying faithful? 50-50 at best. He hated thinking that way, but he couldn't shake it. In a strange, bitter way, he wondered if her being unfaithful would provide a kind of relief. Since the exchange proposal months ago, their marriage had been on a slow decline. Many of their nights of passion were fueled not by love, but by Mel's unspoken desires for someone else. Before the banquet, they had been so close. They talked about their work, their kids, vacation plans, and the small things that made their lives unique. Now, those everyday conversations felt like a distant memory. He missed that connection, and deep down, he didn't know if it was something they could ever get back. Later that day, Will explained the situation to Mark and Sherry, their 2 children. Sherry's high school graduation ceremony was scheduled for Friday morning, but with the trial in Pittsburgh, Will doubted Mel would make it back in time. The judge presiding over the case reserved Fridays for miscellaneous business. It was called Garbage Day, so there was a slim chance Mel might be able to return. Still, Will didn't hold much hope. Each evening, Mel called home to talk to Will and the kids. The calls usually came after 8 p.m., often later. She had little time to spare. Jury selection was scheduled for Monday, and her days were packed with preparations. On Sunday evening, during one of their calls, Will couldn't help himself. "How are things going with Robert?" he asked. "No problems, Will," Mel replied quickly. "I'm just too busy, and so is he." "Is he involved in the preparations?" Will pressed. "Yes, I'd say he's involved," she said lightly, trying to make a joke of it. Will didn't laugh. Mel immediately regretted her tone. "Sorry," she said. "There's nothing going on in that regard. We work in a common room at the hotel. I sleep on the floor above and he goes back to his apartment. I haven't had any offers. Dinner is room service." Will said nothing, and Mel felt the weight of his silence. Jury selection began on Monday, and by the evening the jury was seated. Opening statements were made, though Mel didn't deliver them. Her colleague, Jill Blandon, handled that, aided by carefully prepared diagrams and exhibits. On Tuesday, the plaintiff's case began with 2 expert witnesses. The first expert took the entire day, and Mel conducted a slow, methodical cross-examination. By the end of the day, she was satisfied with her work. Exhausted but focused, she returned to the conference room to prepare for the next day's witness. When Mel finally returned to the shared workroom that evening, Robert was already there. He was animated, happy about how the day in court had gone. As Mel dropped her business bags by the table, Robert pulled her into a big hug and spun her around playfully. "Whoa, big boy," Mel said, laughing nervously. "Don't say hop until you've jumped over." "You were amazing, Mel," Robert said enthusiastically. "Just fantastic." "Thanks," she replied, stepping away from him. "Now I need to eat, get ready for tomorrow, and try to get a good night's sleep." Robert didn't make any moves on her that night, but as she settled into her notes, he said, "When we win this case, I'll take you to my place and make you so happy." Mel simply shook her head, avoiding eye contact, and focused on her work. After eating a quick meal, she went to her room and slept. Wednesday went even better than Tuesday. Mel worked meticulously through the plaintiff's case, methodically dismantling the testimony of the second expert. Though the witness resisted her questions, it was a losing battle for him. By the end of the day, the plaintiff rested their case. The judge denied the defense's motion for judgment, and Mel returned to the workroom, feeling a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. When she arrived, Robert was there again, and this time no one else had arrived yet. Her experts weren't due until 7 p.m. for the final run-through. As Mel set her things down, Robert walked toward her slowly. This time, his hug was soft and lingering, and before she could pull away, he kissed her. To her own surprise, Mel reciprocated, caught up in the moment. Just as things began to escalate, the door opened. Jill Blandon walked in, and the moment shattered. Mel and Robert separated instantly as if nothing had happened. Almost at the same time, the dinner delivery service arrived, creating an awkward commotion. Robert left shortly afterward, and Mel spent the evening briefing her witnesses. By 10 p.m., she retired to her room, her mind spinning. The next morning, as the team arrived at court, the plaintiff's attorney, Herman Billings, requested a meeting with the defense team. Robert, Jill, and Mel joined him in the waiting room, where they met with Morgan Thompson, the CEO and primary client. Thompson wanted to settle. Billings presented a proposal, and Jill immediately countered with an offer she had been refining for over a week. Several rounds of negotiations followed, but ABC's legal team, bolstered by Robert's strong position, held firm. By 11 a.m., an agreement was reached, one that was highly favorable to Robert. The parties filed the agreement in court, and the jury was dismissed. That afternoon, The remaining details of the settlement were finalized, and everyone was free to go. Mel was exhausted. She returned to the hotel, collapsed into bed, and slept for an hour. When she woke up, she took a long shower trying to clear her head. Later that evening, Robert invited the entire team to dinner at a club near his condo. Limousines were arranged for everyone. Before leaving, Mel called home to share the news with Will. She promised to leave Pittsburgh on Friday afternoon, though she admitted she wouldn't make it back in time for Sherry's morning graduation ceremony. Will wasn't happy about the dinner arrangements. The situation was already precarious, and this felt like a breaking point. Before Mel left for the evening, he said to her, "Mel, this is probably when you're most vulnerable." "I know, Will," she replied, attempting to reassure him. "I can handle it." "Okay, congratulations on the case, but don't have too much fun," he said, his tone flat. The club was a lively place, designed for dinner and dancing. Mel and the rest of the team made up a party of 6. Robert, Mel, Jill Blandon, Jonathan Crisp, and 2 other ABC lawyers, Ellie Mason and Mick Diaz. A limousine brought them to the venue, where Robert was already waiting at the table. The food was excellent, as was the wine, and the mood was celebratory. The dancing started at 9 p.m. Robert wasted no time, immediately inviting Mel to the floor. She hesitated but drank a little wine and accepted. As they danced, she couldn't shake the thought that dancing had been the start of all her marital troubles. Still, she pushed it aside. Jill and Jonathan danced too, as did Ellie and Mick, and partners occasionally switched. But Mel noticed that Robert danced with her exclusively, 6 dances in a row. 3 were fast, but the last 3 were slow. The final slow dance left Mel in a difficult position. She later recalled thinking, "I'm 4 hours from home. Will would never find out." As they swayed to the music, Robert leaned in and whispered, "Now we come to me. It's now or never. You're going to have the time of your life." Mel hesitated for a brief moment before replying softly, "Just this once, Robert. No one needs to know." Robert, convinced that her desire for him outweighed her sense of caution, gently led her out of the club. As they left, Mel didn't even think about the 3 lawyers from her firm who clearly understood what was happening. They walked across the street to his condo. The moment they were inside, Robert turned her toward him, pressing her back against the wall. He kissed her deeply, and this time she didn't resist. She kissed him back with equal passion. Robert took her hand and led her into the bedroom, where the bed was already made in anticipation. When it was over, she snuggled up to him, a mix of guilt and exhilaration coursing through her. Minutes passed before Robert broke the silence. "I've never experienced anything like this, Mel." "Never," he said, his voice soft. Mel purred something incomprehensible, then added, "Me neither. Perhaps no one ever." An hour later they made love again. This time they moved slower, more intimately, face to face, locking eyes. Afterward, they showered together and ate a light meal of shrimp, celery, and apple slices before returning to bed. In the morning, they woke up still facing each other. Mel quietly slipped out of bed and went to the bathroom, where she found a new toothbrush waiting. She brushed her teeth, showered, and tried to suppress the growing sense of guilt gnawing at her. When she returned to the bedroom, Robert was sitting on the bed, watching her. "Thank you for the whole night," he said. "It was amazing. The best." "I should feel guilty," Mel replied, struggling to meet his eyes. "But no, it was so over the top." Afterward, Robert showered while Mel dressed. When he came out of the bathroom, still undressed, she glanced at him one last time before leaving. He smiled at her, but she didn't return it. She left the condo, checked out of her hotel, and began the drive back to Virginia. Mel's mind raced as she drove. She told herself she loved Will and hoped he would never find out about what had happened. Still, she reminded herself to speak with the other lawyers, ensuring they would keep quiet. Meanwhile, Will was at home, deeply unsettled. He couldn't shake the feeling that something might happen at Thursday night's dinner. Around 11 p.m., he called Mel's cell phone, but it went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. At midnight, he called her hotel room, but there was no answer. He tried again at 2 a.m. and again at 2:30, claiming it was an emergency. Still, there was no response. Finally, he gave up and tried to sleep, though it didn't come easily. The next morning, Sherry's graduation ceremony went well. She delivered a speech, though not as the top student. Still, Will and Mark were proud of her. Afterward, Will took the kids out to lunch. Sherry went out with friends later that evening, and Mark headed to a friend's house for the night, leaving Will alone at home. He busied himself with errands, spending much of his time in the basement. In the basement, Will had a small training room with a heavy bag, an elliptical machine, and a bench press. There was also a bathroom with a shower, a full-sized refrigerator, a kitchen sink, and a small TV. That evening, he went to Walmart and bought a microwave and hot plate, setting them up to complete the space. He had just finished organizing the room when he heard a car pull into the driveway. Walking up the basement steps to the kitchen, he saw Mel enter the house through the front door. "Honey, I'm home," she called out, her voice unnaturally cheerful. The nervousness was clear in her tone, and Will immediately recognized it. He turned to face her as she entered the kitchen. He was leaning on the sink, his expression unreadable. Mel walked in with a smile, but it vanished the moment she saw his face. She sat down in a kitchen chair, her nerves frayed. "Damn," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. Will's voice was calm, almost emotionless. "I called your hotel room last night at 2:30. Mel froze, knowing there was no way out. Her hope of continuing the marriage died in that moment. "It was just a night," she said, tears running down her face. "No love. No love." Will remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "It doesn't matter. Maybe the memories will keep you warm at night. Or maybe he will. But not me. Never again." "I love you, Will," Mel said through quiet sobs. "I always will." Without another word, she stood up, picked up her suitcase, and went upstairs. Will didn't come back upstairs that day, and Mel didn't go down to the basement. In the quiet of his space, Will poured his focus into writing. He finished a chapter of his latest novel, a story about love and betrayal, and began to consider what his next book might be. Writing had always been his refuge, a way to process his emotions and organize his thoughts. He decided his next project would be about the end of his marriage, a serious, deeply personal book that might take years to write. With a plan forming in his mind, he turned off his computer and made a phone call to his parents. "I just wanted to let you know," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I'll be getting a divorce." He didn't elaborate, and he decided to let Mel inform her own family. Neither Sherry nor Mark was home at the time. Sherry had stayed overnight at her best friend's house after her graduation celebrations, and Mark had been out with friends. Both were due back the next day, Saturday. By then, Will had already contacted Zelda Morrison, a divorce lawyer, to outline the terms of the separation. The proposed agreement was simple. Will would remain in the house with custody of Mark until he graduated from high school. Sherry, now legally an adult, could live independently. When Mark graduated, the house would either be sold or one spouse would buy out the other's share. On Saturday at lunchtime, Sherry and Mark returned home. Mel greeted them at the door, trying to mask her anxiety with a forced smile. Will emerged from the basement shortly after, his expression calm but distant. Both children immediately sensed that something was wrong. The four of them sat at the kitchen table, a familiar space where they'd shared countless family meals and conversations. The tension was palpable. Will spoke first, his voice steady but weighted with emotion. Your mom and I, well, we've come to the end of our marriage, he said. We both still love you, but some things have happened. Mel's eyes widened in shock. She hadn't expected Will to announce their separation so soon. Though she knew their marriage was in deep crisis, the suddenness of his declaration left her stunned. Both children turned to her, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. Sherry broke the silence first. What did you do, Mom? She asked bluntly. Because of those sounds we heard sometimes? Mel froze, her face pale. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she replied, I slept with a client in Pittsburgh. It was one night, Thursday. Mark looked at his father, his tone low and disbelieving. You're divorcing her over one night? Will nodded, his face hardening. Yes, but it's more than just that one night. This didn't come out of nowhere. It's been hanging over me for months. Your mother knew how I felt, knew exactly what this would do to us, and she did it anyway. Mel tried to interject through her tears. It's hard. It's not hard, Will interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp, cutting through the room. For now, I'll be staying in the basement. I'll still work in my office upstairs, and I'll help with meals and other things. We'll figure out the details as we go. I'm sorry it's come to this, but there's no turning back. Mel broke down, tears streaming down her face as she stood and rushed upstairs. Sherry and Mark remained seated, stunned into silence. Finally, they turned to Will. She thought it was so important to have that night with this guy, Will said, his voice breaking slightly, that she was willing to destroy our family for it. She fought it, but in the end, she gave in. And even if she hadn't, once she met him, nothing was the same between us. Sherry's voice was quiet but firm. What's going to happen now? Will she still live here? Will sighed, his exhaustion visible. That's something we'll have to figure out. I'm so sorry this all happened, especially on your graduation weekend, Sherry, but I want you to know how proud I am of you. And of you too, Mark. He stood and pulled both of them into a hug. Upstairs, Mel collapsed onto the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of regret and shame. The night with Robert, which had felt so intoxicating in the moment, now seemed sour and rotten, like spoiled milk. Each time she thought about it, she felt a wave of nausea. How could I have been so selfish? She thought. How could I risk everything for one night? She lay there for hours, replaying the events over and over in her mind. Eventually, the smell of dinner wafted upstairs. It smelled like burgers. Her stomach growled, but she couldn't bring herself to go downstairs. She couldn't face Will or the kids. Downstairs, Will prepared dinner with Mark and Sherry's help. He wondered if the smell of food might lure Mel out of her room, but he doubted it. The three of them ate quietly, the mood somber but manageable. After dinner, they cleaned up together before Sherry and Mark retreated to their rooms. Upstairs, the siblings talked in Sherry's room, trying to process everything, but they couldn't come to any conclusions. At 10 p.m., Will sat alone in the living room, half watching a baseball game. He wasn't really paying attention. He was waiting for Mel. Finally, she appeared, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She sat down across from him. Will turned off the TV and looked at her, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry it all happened so quickly, he said finally. But I didn't see the point in waiting. We're done. It's better to rip the bandage off. Mel's voice trembled. Maybe we should. Maybe you should wait a little. It was just one night, Will. All these years, and it was just one night. Will shook his head slowly. Mel, I warned you. Multiple times. And you still did it. Why should I believe this would stop? You weren't even going to tell me. Next time, you might have gotten away with it. Maybe you already have. Mel's voice cracked. That's not fair. These past few months, after the whole partner swapping thing, I was living on the edge. I was depressed. Because you knew I wanted him and I knew you knew. I felt so far away from you. So you went and did it, Will said coldly. But it wasn't a mistake, was it? This wasn't some stupid, spur-of-the-moment mistake. This was your chance at the ultimate pleasure. And maybe I'd never have known. So tell me, Mel, was it as great as you thought it would be? Mel's face burned with shame. She couldn't answer. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she looked away. That's what I thought, Will said. I'll never compare to him, and I won't try. Marriage isn't just about sex, but it's a big part of it. And for us, it's gone. So there's no marriage left. He stood up slowly, his shoulders heavy with resignation, and walked to his new sleeping place without looking back. The silence that followed felt oppressive, as if the very air in the room was weighed down by unspoken words. Mel sat in the chair, tears streaming down her face, her breathing uneven and shaky. Her hands gripped the armrests tightly, as if holding on to the last remnants of her shattered world. She sat there for several minutes, the tears coming in waves, unable to stop them even if she tried. Finally, she stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. Wiping her face with the back of her hand, she took a deep breath and made her way to Sherry's room. Her steps were slow, hesitant, each one feeling like it required every ounce of strength she had left. She reached the door and knocked softly. For a moment, there was no sound, and she thought Sherry might not open the door. Then, the handle turned, and the door creaked open. Sherry stood there, her expression conflicted, somewhere between anger and hurt, but mostly confusion. Mel looked at her, and her lips trembled as she spoke. I love you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I messed up, but I love you. I'm so sorry I missed prom. For a moment, Sherry just stared at her. Then, with a sigh, she stepped forward and hugged her mother tightly. Mel clung to her as if the embrace might somehow fix everything that had gone wrong. But then Sherry pulled back slightly, her eyes brimming with tears. Mom, she said, her voice cracking. How could you do this to all of us? I don't understand. Mel lowered her gaze, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. Me too, she whispered, almost inaudibly. I don't understand either. At that moment, the sound of a door opening caught both their attention. Mark stepped out of his room, his face serious, though there was a flicker of worry in his eyes. Where's Dad? He asked, his voice steady but laced with apprehension. Mel looked at him, her face pale. Downstairs, she said softly. In my sanctuary. She turned back to her children, the weight of her actions pressing heavily on her chest. I apologize to you, Sherry. I apologize to you, Mark. I love you both. Never forget that. The next steps, they're going to be hard. For all of us. She opened her arms and pulled them both into a hug, holding them tightly, as though trying to protect them from the storm she had unleashed. After a few moments, she let them go and walked to her room. Once inside, she closed the door and collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in the pillow as fresh sobs racked her body. Mark turned to Sherry after their mother left. At least we can sleep better now, he muttered. His voice was flat, devoid of any real emotion. Then he turned and went back to his room, shutting the door firmly behind him. The next day, Will went to the lawyer's office. The lawyer, a no-nonsense professional with sharp eyes, already had the necessary documents prepared. She placed them neatly on the desk in front of him, her pen poised in her hand. "Everything is ready," she said briskly. "You just need to sign here, and we can begin." Will picked up the pen without hesitation and signed his name at the bottom of the document. As he slid it back toward her, they began discussing the next steps. "It might take longer if Mel resists," the lawyer explained. "She's an exceptional attorney herself, and she works at one of the best firms in the city. If she chooses to contest the divorce, it could complicate things." Will shrugged. "Zelda said this all feels like it's happening too fast," he replied. "But honestly, I've been expecting this for months. I warned her. I told her exactly what would happen if she went through with it, but she didn't listen. And now it's happening. I see no reason to delay. This marriage is over." The lawyer nodded, her expression neutral. "Understood. I can file electronically and have the documents delivered this afternoon. Just one more signature here." Will signed again, his movements firm and deliberate. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Mel sat in her office, staring blankly at her computer screen. Around her, colleagues stopped by occasionally to congratulate her on a recent case victory, their smiles oblivious to the turmoil inside her. She nodded and thanked them, forcing a polite smile, but her face remained an emotionless mask. Inside, she felt hollow. Later that evening, Abe, her mentor and longtime friend, called her into his office. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he regarded her. "What the hell, Mel?" he said finally, his tone a mixture of frustration and concern. "I mean, Jesus." Mel looked down at her hands, her voice trembling. "I was weak," she said softly. I told all of you, I was weak and he took advantage of it. And now, I've lost everything." Abe sighed heavily. "You haven't lost everything. You're brilliant, you're successful. You'll find someone else, Mel." "Look at you." Mel shook her head. "Not someone I love," she said, her voice breaking. "Not Will." "Give him time," Abe said gently. "Maybe he'll come around." She nodded slowly, but deep down, she didn't believe him. Later that afternoon, her secretary knocked on her door and brought in a young man holding a thick envelope. Mel stared at it for a moment before accepting it. The weight of the documents felt unbearable, like they were crushing her soul. She opened the envelope and scanned the papers inside. Divorce papers. She felt a cold emptiness settle in her chest. Finally, she called Morse Sloan, the firm's family law specialist, and invited him and Abe into Abe's office. She handed them copies of the documents, her hands trembling slightly. Abe flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed. "Damn," he muttered. "That was fast." Mel nodded. "He knew this was coming," she said quietly. Moore adjusted his glasses and read through the documents carefully. "If the allegations are true, these terms seem fair," he said finally. "He was the primary caregiver, right?" "Yes," Mel said. "Mostly. He worked from home." "Well, you have 20 days to respond," Moore continued. "Do you want to contest it? Even if you do, he's likely to get the divorce in the end." Mel hesitated, her mind racing. "I need time to think," she said finally. When Mel got home early that evening, she found Will in his office, typing away. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him before speaking. "I'm home," she said softly. "I got the documents." "Fine," he replied without looking up. Mel lingered for a moment, hoping he would say something more, but he didn't. She turned and walked to the kitchen, her thoughts swirling. Memories of their time together, the love, the laughter, the closeness, played like a cruel slideshow in her mind. The thought of losing all of that felt unbearable. Will slid to the floor, his back pressed against the stove. His head sank into his hands as he began to cry, the tears coming unbidden, raw and heavy with the weight of everything he was carrying. It was real pain, sharp, unbearable. He felt hollowed out, like something vital had been ripped from him. And yet, despite the agony, he didn't approach Mel. How could he? She was the one who had plunged the knife into him, and the wound still bled. Mel watched him from across the table, her own tears falling freely. For the first time, she truly saw the pain she had caused him. Up close, stark and undeniable. It wasn't just sadness. It was devastation, and it broke something inside her. Slowly, she walked around the table and knelt beside him. Without hesitation, she reached out and wrapped her arms around him, cradling his head as he wept. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." She stroked his hair as tears streamed down her face. It wasn't forgiveness. She knew better than to hope for that, but it was connection, however fragile. That's how Sherry found them when she walked in through the patio door. Her eyes widened at the sight of her parents on the kitchen floor, holding onto each other like broken pieces of the same puzzle. She froze, unsure of what to do. "Mom? Dad?" she said softly, her voice cracking. Will and Mel turned their heads in unison, their tear-streaked faces a mirror of each other's grief. Slowly, they stood up, moving as if they were one, without hesitation. They approached their daughter, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they embraced her together. Sherry began to cry too, and they held her tightly, the three of them bound together in a moment of shared pain. The following weeks passed in a haze of uncertainty and routine. Mel responded to the lawsuit, filing the necessary paperwork and scheduling a consultation. Her response didn't deny the facts, but it didn't offer much resolution either. It was a procedural step, nothing more. Mark left for football camp, a 2-week reprieve from the tension at home, while Sherry took a job as a counselor at a nature camp in West Virginia. Their absence left Mel and Will alone in the house, a situation neither of them knew how to navigate. Will continued to cook, his movements precise and mechanical, but there was almost no other interaction between them. They worked, they ate, but they didn't talk about anything beyond logistics. There was no intimacy, no physical contact, not even accidental brushes of hands. When the matter finally came to a hearing, a consultation was scheduled. By that time, Mel was deeply unsettled by Will's aloofness. She had grown used to his coldness, but the consistent emotional distance felt like an ever-deepening chasm. He cooked meals for the kids when they were home, but when it was just the two of them, he would barely make cereal for himself. One surprising discovery during this time was that neither of them felt attracted to anyone else. Will realized he was numb in that regard. Women he encountered in his daily life, whether at the grocery store or during errands, barely registered to him. Even the attractive blonde neighbor he'd once found appealing didn't stir anything inside him anymore. Mel, too, had no interest in anyone else. She sometimes thought about trying to win Will back completely, but she knew him too well. Any attempt to rekindle intimacy would only push him further away. Over time, she began to lose hope that their marriage could be salvaged. That's where they were when they attended their first consultation session with Dr. Mary Stevens. Dr. Stevens was a composed, confident woman in her early 50s, with a calm presence that seemed to fill the room. She had asked them beforehand to write down the basics of what had happened and what they hoped to achieve moving forward. She began the session without preamble. "Both of you are deeply depressed," she said bluntly. "Melody, you're losing hope that this marriage can be saved. And Will, you're tormented by the belief that you'll never satisfy your wife the way her lover did." She paused to let the words sink in. The question now is, what can be done? Will's voice was quiet but firm. I think we need to be apart. Seeing her every day, it's torture for me. Mel turned to look at him, her expression one of quiet desperation. We had good nights before Robert, she said softly. Even when I craved him, we still had good nights. Dr. Stevens tilted her head slightly. But, Mel, you understand that Will doesn't want to be compared, and especially not to lose in that comparison. Night is night, Mel replied, her voice growing defensive. There were maybe 3 times in our entire marriage where he didn't satisfy me. Will's jaw tightened. But not like Robert, right? Dr. Stevens glanced at Mel, waiting for her answer. Mel hesitated, then said, The night with Robert was great, but he had the huge advantage of being new and different. Will, you would have that too now. It's been so long. Will's expression hardened. Don't be mean, Mel. Why didn't you just go to him? Then, I try not to think about that night, Mel said, her voice shaking. Because when I do, I feel sick. I feel nauseous. And I have to distract myself. Dr. Stevens leaned forward slightly. Mel, did you see Robert after that night? No, she replied quickly. He's been to our office twice, but I don't keep in touch with him. When I'm warned he's coming, I make sure I don't cross paths with him. Dr. Stevens turned to Will. And you, Will? Why didn't you try to reconnect intimately with Mel? Will's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. Because I see them together in my head. Every time. It's like a loop that won't stop playing. He paused. We're destroyed. Dr. Stevens nodded. Are you attracted to other women? No, Will said flatly. Not even the blonde neighbor I used to find attractive. It's just nothing. Over the weekend, Will decided to take a break. He drove to a rented cabin by a lake in West Virginia, leaving his computer behind and taking only a notepad. He had been struggling with creative block for days, and he hoped the solitude might help. On Saturday morning, he drove to Pittsburgh. He spent 8 hours there, walking through the city without a plan, taking no photos, making no notes. He simply observed, letting the sights and sounds wash over him. Sunday was spent quietly in the cabin, where he let his thoughts wander. That evening, he called home and told Mel he would be staying a few extra days to try to relax. On Monday, he returned to Pittsburgh, spending 10 more hours wandering the city. By the time he came home on Tuesday afternoon, he felt a small but noticeable shift. The trip hadn't cured him, but it had given him fresh ideas for his next thriller. Their second counseling session felt different. Will came in with a lighter mood, and Mel couldn't help but notice the change. Dr. Stevens began with her usual directness, but this time, the tension in the room was slightly less suffocating. Mel allowed herself a flicker of hope, but it was fleeting. Despite Will's improved mood, she could still sense an underlying tension in him, a silent wall that hadn't budged. At home, his shoulder tics returned, a subtle reminder of the stress that still lingered beneath the surface. Will returned to the cabin once again after Mark had come back home to spend some time with Mel. On Saturday, he made another trip to Pittsburgh and, as before, spent hours wandering the city on foot, seeking inspiration and solace. By Monday, he was back at the cabin, and on Tuesday, he finally returned home. The brief escape offered him some clarity, though not nearly enough to resolve the complex tangle of emotions he felt. That Wednesday, Mark left for a nature camp where Sherry was working as a counselor. The house felt eerily quiet without the kids, and Will buried himself in his office, trying to focus on his work. It was late in the morning when he heard a knock on the door. Surprised, he got up and opened it to find his blonde neighbor, Linda Miller, standing there. Linda had lived next door for 6 years. She was 30, stunningly beautiful, with bright blonde hair, light skin, and a curvy figure that always seemed to draw attention. She was divorced and had a 7-year-old daughter, Velma, who was spending the summer holidays with her father. Today, Linda stood before him in a pair of snug workout shorts, a loose t-shirt and flip-flops, her hair tied back in a casual ponytail. "Hi, Will," she said, smiling brightly. "I thought maybe you could help me with my kitchen sink. It's clogged, and I've got a wrench, but I don't really know what I'm doing." Will blinked, surprised by the sudden request. "Sure," he said after a brief pause. He stepped back to grab his sneakers. Linda had always intrigued him. In many ways, she was the opposite of Mel. Where Mel was intellectual and sharp-edged, Linda was soft, playful, and open. Over the years, she had harbored a quiet attraction to Will. He reminded her of her first boyfriend, intelligent, calm, and quietly confident. Though Linda wasn't particularly intellectual herself, she had always liked smart men. She had watched the comings and goings from Will's house over the years, and more recently, she had noticed how often he used the basement entrance. The air of mystery surrounding him intrigued her. Will followed Linda to her house around the corner. She led him to her kitchen, where the sink was indeed clogged. He crouched down to inspect the pipes, pulling out the wrench and tape she handed him. As Will worked, Linda stood over him, leaning slightly against the counter. From his position under the sink, he couldn't help but notice her legs, toned and smooth, the shorts leaving little to the imagination. She didn't make an effort to hide it, either. Her presence felt deliberate, intentional. When Will finished installing the trap and unclogging the drain, he slid out from under the sink and sat up, looking at her. "Didn't you once tell me your father was a plumber?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Linda smiled coyly. "I might have," she said, "but I wanted to see you like this, on your back." Will felt a flash of unease as he realized the boldness of her words. "You're watching," he said slowly, unsure of how to respond. "I thought you might like it," Linda said softly. That's when he noticed she had slipped off her flip-flops. She took a step closer, her voice dropping. "I want it. I usually get what I want from guys. Come with me." Without waiting for his response, she turned around, hooked her thumbs into the waistband of her shorts, and pulled them down as she walked away, her hips swaying provocatively. Will stood there for a moment, frozen in indecision. Then, almost mechanically, he dropped his shorts and boxers, pulled off his t-shirt, and followed her upstairs, feeling like a rat caught in the tune of the Pied Piper. When they reached her bedroom, Linda turned around, pulling off her t-shirt and tossing it aside. For a fleeting second, Will thought he should stop and think about what he was doing, about his marriage, about Mel. But the thought vanished almost as quickly as it came. He gave in to the moment, to the temptation that had lingered unspoken between them for years. Afterward, as they dressed in silence, Linda glanced at him. "I've seen you walking back and forth through the back door," she said casually. "I can see across the yards, I saw the bed being delivered there. I wonder if it's comfortable." Will raised an eyebrow. "It is," he replied. "You'll have to let me try it sometime," she said with a sly smile. Then, frowning slightly, she added, "But I can be loud. I don't know if I'm ready to throw that in her face just yet. Maybe later." Will didn't respond. He simply stood up, finished dressing, and walked back to his house through the back door. The first thing he did was take a long shower. Standing under the scalding water, he tried to process what had just happened. He had always been aware of the mutual attraction between himself and Linda, but the blatant seductiveness of the encounter left him feeling unsettled. It wasn't just about Linda. It was about Mel, about their broken marriage, about everything he had lost and everything he still couldn't understand. He shook the thoughts from his head and went to his office to write. That evening Will prepared dinner. He grilled cutlets and made a salad for two, setting the patio table as the sun began to set. When Mel arrived home, he lit the grill and poured her a glass of red wine, a mixed California blend he knew she liked. "Dinner in 20, he said. "Want a drink?" "Sure," Mel replied, offering him a small smile. They sat on the patio, eating together in relative peace. Will asked her about work, and she spoke about a new project she was working on, carefully avoiding any mention of Robert. The omission wasn't obvious, but it was deliberate. "I'm working on a new thriller," Will said, breaking a brief silence. "The ideas came to me while I was at the cabin. Being away from everything. Our problems," Mel said quietly, finishing his sentence. Will gave her a brief explanation of the plot, something about a killer hiding in plain sight, but he didn't go into detail. Mel listened, nodding along, but she didn't ask many questions. After dinner, they tidied up together, finished their wine, and retreated to their separate rooms. That evening, Will couldn't stop thinking about Linda. The encounter had stirred something in him, though he wasn't sure what. Mel, meanwhile, had noticed the subtle change in his mood but didn't press him on it. She also didn't mention divorce, though it lingered unspoken between them like a phantom in the room. A couple of times, she glanced out the window toward Linda's house, but Linda wasn't home. She was out on a date with a man she considered a long-term prospect, a wealthy, somewhat short but fit man named Horace. In the following days, Linda and Will began a pattern. Every morning, they would meet at her house, and their encounters grew longer and more intense, stretching into hours. For Linda, it was exciting, a distraction, a thrill. For Will, it was something else entirely, though he couldn't quite articulate what. By the time he arrived for his third counseling session with Mel, he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and detachment. Mel was already seated when he walked in, and Dr. Mary Stevens greeted them both. For a long moment, neither Will nor Mel spoke. Finally, Will broke the silence. "I understand you arranged this," he said, addressing Mel. "Thank you." He wasn't being sarcastic, but the tension in his voice was palpable. Mary looked at him, waiting for him to elaborate, but Will wasn't in the mood to mince words. "You know what?" he said simply. Mary raised an eyebrow, and Mel shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The session had only just begun, but the unspoken tension between them was already suffocating. "Honestly," Mary said, "we both thought this would be good for you. It was, wasn't it?" Will replied, "Absolutely. So good. I'll never forget this as long as I live." He looked at Mel, a grin spreading across his face. A flash of anger flickered across hers. "Don't be mean, Will," Mary chided. "You need to understand that Mel made a sacrifice." Will nodded. "I see that. But there's a big difference," he added, looking directly at Mel. Mel chimed in, "Yeah, you've done this every day this week. The difference is I didn't want you to cheat. But you set this up because you cheated." Mel's tone grew uncertain. "I didn't even like it. Will, was she better than me?" Will, smart enough to avoid stepping into that trap, shrugged without answering. Mary interjected, "Will, this just shows how much Mel wants to move past what happened." Will nodded again. "Yeah, I can see that. And maybe it'll work. In a few weeks." He suddenly started giggling. Mel snorted. "I'll call her off," she snapped. Will grinned. "You can't. I'm winding her up." Mel sank into her chair, then stood abruptly. "Okay," she declared. "She gets the days and I get the nights. I need it, damn it." Will growled. "You're beautiful and hot. You could have anyone." "I know I could," Mel retorted. "But I want you." I love you. I only want you. Once things calmed down, Mary spoke again. I'd like to schedule a session for the two of you in about 2 weeks to see how things are going. Mel and Will drove home separately that Thursday afternoon. Will had plans to go to a cabin for the weekend and had no intention of canceling them. He felt it was important to get away, so he stayed at the cabin until Monday afternoon. While Will was gone, Mel and Linda met at Linda's house to talk about him. During their conversation, Mel finally said, "I think your involvement has to end now." Linda smiled faintly. "My boyfriend Horace is short and chubby, but he's rich and sweet. Will, on the other hand, is not short or chubby, and he's real talent, as you know. So, if I'm being invited to leave, why should I?" Mel glared. "Because I want to try to stitch my marriage back together. See if it lasts. And you're a complication." Linda smirked. "I wasn't a complication when you asked me to help." "No, you weren't. It helped a lot. But you clearly got a lot out of it too." "He's my husband, not yours." Linda's smile widened. "Maybe I could win him over." Mel's tone turned sharp, almost dangerous. "You really don't want to do this?" Linda raised her hands, feigning innocence. "Oh, okay. How about this? We split it up over time. I won't try to keep it, but I'd like to finish gradually." Mel didn't believe her. "You can go out and get any guy you want." "And so can you," Linda replied coolly. "But sure, I'll back off. For you." Mel thought for a moment. Then she said, "I want my family back, Linda." "Okay. Monday night, all night, and then you stop. After that, I'll knock on his door Tuesday night." "You can't." Linda shrugged. "Deal. Just don't get knocked up." She chuckled. "I have another guy lined up as a backup anyway. But I won't." On Monday afternoon, Will returned home from his weekend at the cabin. He had enjoyed the time away, even managing to get some writing done on Sunday. In fact, he'd made an offer to buy the cabin before leaving. That night, he ordered pizza for dinner and ate in silence. Mel seemed unusually quiet, and he decided to leave it at that. Later that night, at around 11 p.m., there was a soft knock on his basement door. It was Linda. She was wearing a short, shameless dress and nothing else. "This is our last time," she whispered. "All night long. Let's make it count." They didn't hold back, making plenty of noise, enough for Mel to hear upstairs. Will figured it was only fair. After that night, Linda moved on. Her daughter was coming home, and she decided to focus on her boyfriend, Horace. On Tuesday, Will prepared a simple pasta dish and tomato salad for two. He knew Mel would be looking for more than just dinner, and he decided not to resist. Between them, there was a strange balance, one they both seemed committed to maintaining for the sake of their marriage. That evening, Mel joined him in the basement. She stayed all night. She woke him at 5:30 a.m., hungry, and he prepared breakfast for her. As they ate, Mel looked at Will and asked, "Are we okay? I mean, we'll never really be equals. You threw me a bone and I took it, but it was you I wanted. I would never have approved of what you did. Still, it was nice of you." Will paused, then replied, "I have to work. I'm going to the cabin this Thursday. I've got a separate project I'm working on there, and I need some space. I made an offer to buy the cabin. If the deal goes through, I'll take you there." Mel nodded. "I haven't asked much about it. Either I get it or I don't. I'll find out soon enough." That weekend, Will was incredibly productive. His plans and ideas for a new thriller came together smoothly, and by the end of his stay, he finalized the deal to buy the cabin. On Monday morning, he returned home. For the rest of the week, he and Mel shared their marital bed. For Mel, sleep was a secondary consideration. She felt as though she had fallen behind and was determined to catch up. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed, and Will found them admirable. On Thursday evening, Mel came home from work and said, "Will, I have to tell you something. It's about Robert. Well, he seems to have disappeared. On Sunday, he had dinner at a restaurant he goes to often. On his way home, he left the restaurant after a few drinks, but he never made it to his apartment, just 6 blocks away. That's what Abe told me. The search has started, and now the police are looking for him." Will listened carefully and then fell silent. After a pause, he said, "I'm sure he'll turn up somewhere. Maybe he's got a new crush or ended up with the wrong woman." Mel stared at Will for a long moment before she said, "Will." He cut her off quickly. "No, I didn't mean you." Although Mel and Will were back on track after about a year, it hadn't been easy. It was difficult at first, but they both worked hard, both individually and with Mary's help. They spent most weekends at the cabin, which had become a refuge for them. Over time, the bed there became so worn out that it had to be replaced. In the end, the cabin became their only real escape. After a year of uncertainty, they seemed to have found balance again. Still, Will was always on guard, and Mel was acutely aware of it. As it turned out, Robert was never found, not even a year later. The longer he was missing, the more everyone believed that some kind of accident had happened. His business accounts were in perfect order, and there was no apparent reason for him to have disappeared voluntarily. However, he had been involved in 2 transactions with questionable individuals. One of those deals had fallen through, resulting in lost money. The authorities focused on these transactions during their investigation. They even questioned Gloria's poor husband. Despite their efforts, no arrests were made, and no one ever approached Will with questions. What did you think of today's story? If you enjoyed this, subscribe to JK Tells a Story for more tales.